So today, I want to introduce the first panel, which will be focusing on interpreting Russian society at wartime. And so we have a great lineup of presenters. And so without further ado, let me just turn to introducing them. Basically, we will ask each speaker to present for about 10 minutes, and that should allow plenty of time for discussion where we invite your input. And so the first speaker, wait, is Maria here? Oh, Maria's right here. Okay. Well, maybe we can turn, Greg, would you be prepared to go first while Maria gets settled?
Whatever she prefers.
Okay. It's not 11:15 yet.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think actually that clock may be a little fast. So if you're ready to go, we can.
Somebody else to go. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So Greg, are you okay going next? So we'll just go in the order that they are on the program with this exception. So our first presenter will be Greg Youdin from Princeton University, and he will be talking on no turning back, social divisions, and a new vision for Russia.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for setting this up and thank you for that conversation. I forget the no turning back part. We can get to it in the Q&A session. Can you hear me properly?
No.
Oh, really? Well, I will try to be louder. So, yeah, and how do I?
Yes, exactly.
Well, one of the most important effects of this war, and also probably one of the key reasons to start it, is to foreclose the political alternatives for Russia, which were actually very much in the making before the war. And I would like to remind you of a set of events that happened just before the war. First of all, the record-breaking protests inside the country, across the country, with a very wide geography in 2021. Then there was a change in electoral landscape, with the most important thing being the bridge being established between the so-called systemic and non-systemic opposition, which resulted in a few surprising election outcomes. We have actually witnessed the emergence of new political leaders and also very important new grassroots campaigns using the pretty new techniques for Russia, such as crowdfunding and crowdsourcing. But also, perhaps most importantly, we saw new but immediately pretty deep divisions in the country. They surfaced, I think, in 2017, 2018, and then got only more prominent. It is those divisions that I would like to pay attention to in this talk. Because the only way to chart out an alternative future for the country, for any country, I guess, is by looking at the social conflicts as sources of change and progress. And in Russia, there are many, and this is what I would like to cover in this short talk. One single thing that I think is most detrimental to any invention of political alternatives once again in any country, but in Russia for that matter, is centralization, to glossing over the very real cleavages that are out there. And it is, of course, the essence of Putin's conservative identity politics to shape Russian identities immutable, as inseparable from the Russian states, and as transcendent history, basically as transhistorical. And of course, marginalizing anyone who doesn't share it. Those who present other versions of Russian identity are silenced or excluded. And this is why actually I'm wary of the concepts like Russian identity that do the work, I think, of essentialization. You know what no one would seriously consider the idea of American identity these days, or a Dutch identity in those polarized societies, where there are clearly multiple versions of identity in competition. And Russia is, of course, is a no less complex society. So what I would like to do to illustrate it is to look at those divisions to recognize the source of multiple competing identities that might be in place there. Now, everyone who knows me knows that I call for caution when dealing with the poll numbers in Russia, both before the war and after its outbreak. Briefly, I think poll numbers are, for a number of reasons, completely useless for the purposes with which they are most often used, as, so to say, plebiscites on popular will, on supporting something or someone. But they, of course, that doesn't mean that they are completely useless. They can be useful when you go deeper into things like cross sections or time series, provided, of course, that you are cautious enough. So what I would like to do here is to look at some data very superficially and to highlight several crucial divisions. I'm relying here on one data set, one collected by Russian Field, which I think right now is the leading pollster in the country. This is the February data. They have this longitudinal study. This is, I guess, the 14th wave. And this, of course, is very consistent across those waves. This is the divide that we first saw, I think, in 2017 to 2018, and it got aggravated since then. This is the age divide. You have here the share of those who would have reversed the decision to start the so-called special military operation had they been given a chance to do so. Well, those disproportions are pretty stable, which, of course, invites the conclusion that this is a war waged by the old against the young. Then you have the class divide, and what they do here, they use the famous six-stratum measure of affluence. They aggregate it into groups, the more affluent and less affluent, by purchasing power. And you have here the share of those who would prefer to continue the special military operation or start peace negotiations. And here you have a divide. Actually, if you go deeper, if you break it down to disaggregate these larger categories, you will see even clearer correlation between the affluence and the willingness to go on. That, of course, invites the other clear conclusion that this is a war waged by the rich against the poor. And then you have the geographical divide. So what I did here, these are my own calculations with this data set. You have here the share of those who would prefer to start peace negotiations over continuing with this special military operation, so this share is charted here, but it is divided between the less affluent and the more affluent across the so-called federal, what you call them, districts or what. Interestingly, you pretty much everywhere you see that the less affluent are more willing to go with the peace scenario. It disappears in Moscow and in Northwest, which of course largely St. Petersburg. So what we see here, I think, is a clear regional disparities and, well, more or less obvious fact that the regional elites are key beneficiaries of the war at this point. As some research has already demonstrated, that there is excessive mobilization from low resource strata, basically from those who have lower levels of social capital, who have less, so to say, orientation, less understanding of how to evade drafting, and those who are more easily bribed into, they call it volunteering for the war. This is what I call structural imperialism. The war takes a heavier toll on the minorities, on the ethnic minorities, due to their structural weakness. So it's not a racism or imperialism as such, but rather structural imperialism. So these groups are less affluent, and therefore they are easy targets for the mobilization, and therefore the losses are heavier among those groups. So those are just some divides that I would like to highlight. I could go on with the other interesting topic would be gender divide, which is, I think, clearly emerging there. But just to sum it up, what we see here is with those very, very basic charts is a picture of a deeply divided country, including, of course, its regarding its experience of war. I would actually say that it is divided to such extent that it will be difficult to tell. That's my fear. What holds us all together after the war is over. This is the war which is waged by the old and the rich against the country's young and poor, in attempt, of course, to assimilate them under singular political identity, historical identity, version of history. I think that for that reason, it is now high time for developing alternative visions for Russia's future. Something that I think, as these numbers suggest, is long overdue. Any such vision should be driven by these cleavages, aim at exploiting them, of course, and articulate the grievances and hopes of those who are oppressed right now, as opposed to unspecified political messaging to the Russians in general. The Russians listen, or the Russians should understand, which is unlikely to have effect. I think any platform of a peace party has to address what are the real concerns of the oppressed, and what are the real audiences who now feel powerless. The young, the poor, the weak, and I could go on and on. So my point here was to emphasize the importance of those divisions for building alternatives. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Maria Snegovaya from Georgetown University and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. And she'll be talking about factoring identity in Russian support.
Good morning, everybody. My talk today is devoted to the role of individual level factors trying to explain the support for the war. Now, there's a lot of scholars and analysts who argued at the start of the war that Russians do not support it, and that actually numbers are fake. I'm glad that even Greg Yudin, who actively speaks up against the usage of polls on the Russian context, actually does rely on polls in his presentation. I'm happy he's changing his mind, because that's indeed what has been happening. All of the studies that have tried to analyze the reliability of polls have not found the evidence of preference falsification. And in general, we so far have to rely on them, partly because we don't have any other information about the Russian society. Second, because there's no evidence that the polls are actually unreliable. To the extent that we can talk of maybe some sort of shifts, at best you can talk there's some anti-war supporters for maybe falsifying the preferences. Again, that's not been proven. But the majority, most of the polls are reliable, and the anti-war groups are very few. So where does it leave us? This leaves us with the fact that consistently every single war that Putin starts actually leads to public acquiescence after some time around this war. Here's the data from 2015 war in Syria. A month before Putin starts the war, sends the troops to support Bashar Assad. Uh, 2/3 of society opposing it, and a month after, a couple of weeks after, about the same amount supporting it. With the war in Ukraine, we have seen exactly the same dynamic, and the fact that it fits the same trends as we've seen before is another confirmation that that's exactly what we've seen. Only 8% of Russians support the war, like sending troops to Ukraine. In December 2021, and these numbers are accordingly next to 80% in March 2022. However, studies that try to explain this particular dynamic, the war support, are few. And our effort here with Graham Robertson and Peter Pomerantsev is try to fit in this space. By conformity or the tendency to acquiesce with the war, we refer to the influence of the opinions of the public leaders on the views of the society. To the extent that the studies have been done at all, they mostly have focused on the role of these factors in explaining regime support, and indeed, they have demonstrated that the public in Russia tends to follow the flow, so to speak. They tend to increase the support in the instances when they see others also are supportive of, say, a particular leader, say Putin. To the extent that the war support analysis has been done, we have a study by Krishnarjan and Tolstrup, who have demonstrated indeed that the preferences for military use are also highly manipulable. But the bad and very concerning finding, so to speak, very problematic finding there is that they're only manipulable in one direction. That is, you can make Russians more pro-war, but it's very hard to make them anti-war. Before the war, in the poll run before February 2022, they have shown that even in one time, fairly small, fairly weak priming is able to shift significant share of the sample in favor of the war support. For example, they've been told that somewhere in the Baltics, there's an effort to ban the use of Russian language from the public sphere, and instantly they saw an increase in a significant increase in number of people supporting the idea of sending troops there. Now, they suspect at the end of the article that because we see the support for war going on into only one direction, there's something to do with ideological preference among the Russians, but they don't really study that. And other studies that, to the extent that they focused on this topic, they looked at the role of the collective identification, being like feeling that you're part of Russia, strongly identifying with Russia in this dynamic. So some of the studies do indeed find very, again, concerning results that, for example, support for military operation in Ukraine and even violence against civilians and the use of nuclear weapons tend to be associated with higher strength of the identity, higher salience of individual identity, collective self or belonging to Russia. That is not necessarily new. There are other studies in other contexts that show similar things, except that in Russia, this is exacerbated by the fact that Russians do have a tendency towards blind patriotism, meaning that essentially they tend to support the idea that my country, right or wrong. And that certainly does intensify the connection between salience of identity and war support, especially given the fact that the Russian collective self-esteem is quite insecure following the collapse of the Soviet system and essentially lack of clear understanding who we are. As I mentioned before, there are other studies showing similar dynamic, demonstrated that strength of in-group attachment actually does tend to increase salience of threats to social identity and to one's country, to one's group. Even studies of populism have shown that in-group attachment does tend to increase susceptibility to populist messages. Obviously, we have seen that here happening here in the United States. So in light of this evidence, our framework here is indeed to see if the salience of own identity does moderate susceptibility to pro-war messages. Essentially, identity in this sense will be serving a moderator for susceptibility, willingness to support the war after, say, Putin expresses support for a particular militaristic, more aggressive escalatory action. So that's what we've done. We used a series of experiments in which essentially, in one case, Putin supported peace talks in Ukraine, and in another one, he said that it's not the time for peace talks. Subsequently, we asked our respondents whether they personally believed, how important for them personally was that Russia begins peace negotiations with Ukraine, and also what they thought about the rest of Russians. Just to demonstrate to you that the treatments were very fairly weak, the control group was just asked a personal belief about the need to start peace talks with Ukraine. In the negative treatment, Putin says that he does not support this idea. And in the positive treatment, President Putin says that he supports this idea. Actually, we tried several framings. The last one is this weakest one. So the negative and positive identical. This one is the from a different pilot, but essentially we try different framings from the positive one. Most of them were identical. Now, how did we measure identity? It's a highly philosophical question. A lot of literature deals with this issue, but essentially it's a measure of the strength of belonging to a particular collective group, a certain community. In the Russian case, we think of this community as Russia, right, broadly understood. There are other ways to measure it through patriotism, being proud of, nationalism, feeling like it's better for me to be a citizen of Russia, secure national identification, that's just I'm glad to be Russian, collective narcissism, that I'm not just glad being Russian, but I also insist that Russians should be given fair treatment, and strength of identification with Russia and different elements of its culture. All of them are strongly correlated with each other. I just want to mention that in social psychology literature, there's a lot of efforts to differentiate between secure national identification and collective narcissism. But in our analysis, we see that all of these measures more or less show the same thing. This is just a demonstration of personalization of all these various dimensions of identity. I'm happy to return to that during the Q&A. For our experimental design purposes, we obviously included all of the regular controls and ran a series of pilots, essentially see if identity indeed does have an effect. And here are the results of the two pilots that we've shown, about 400 respondents per group. So again, apologies if it's too small, but I'm going to have to walk you through this results. So first of all, just as the paper that I've referenced before, we see that negative treatment has the most significant effect. Even something as small as Putin saying that it's not time right now, it's not the time for peace talks, significantly shifts responding individual opinion on the war, and also feeling that others similarly do not support the peace talks. Even if it kind of varies from pilot to pilot, in this other pilot, the results that I'm showing, only individual perception is shifting, but in all instances, the impact is negative. When it comes to the positive treatment, we don't necessarily find the same effect. We therefore try to reinforce the positive treatment, as you've seen, but unfortunately, no effect. That's very consistent with the other study that I mentioned. So we can shift respondents' opinions, but somehow only in support of more war, not less war. Second, when it comes to the salience of identity, and here it's selected in yellow, again, apologies for the small font, but you'll see that the interaction with identity in most instances is just as expected, very significant, strong, and the highest salience of individual identities, whether you measure it for patriotism, collective, like national, secure national identification, or insecure one, we actually tend to find the same thing, that there's a strong association between the individual like salience, high salience of identity, in position to p stalks. This is for pilot 4, and this is for pilot 5. We also kind of obviously know that these are individual like correlation interactions, but as I mentioned before, all these various dimensions of identity are highly correlated. So what do we find is that, first of all, unfortunately, only a negative frame seems to be shifting our respondents, and salience of identity appears to be really a moderator, meaning that people who stronger identify with Russia, they're more willing to actually embrace more militant pro-war statements. Having said that, it's also true that those identity characteristics, they're all correlated. So we decided maybe we just cluster them together and see whether we can segment our sample into different clusters, depending on the salience of identity. And indeed, that's what we were able to do. Our cluster analysis returned 3 substantial groups, the so-called regime supporters, or war supporters, if you will. They have the highest levels of identity, about 45% of the sample. The loyalists, somewhere in the middle. The salience of identity is still high but lower. And then the so-called like the cosmopolites, the critics, all of us, I guess, the group most conflicted on their identity, and there's about 13% of the sample. It's online, so you can imagine this is also biased towards more anti-war respondents, probably. So this is how the cluster groups looked like. This cluster 1 is in red. It looks smallest, but it's just because they're all clustered very closely together. There's a lot of observations in that particular cluster. We then repeated the analysis with the treatment, the interaction, to find that the first cluster, those with the highest levels salience of identity, indeed are the most responsive to the negative treatment. So there's like the core group of so-called patriots who seem to be moving and be very responsive to more militaristic messages. When it comes to the positive treatment, we have discovered that it's the cluster 3. So the liberals who are actually tend to be moving, more likely to move with the positive cluster, but not the other 2. To conclude, how do we sum up all of these results? Well, at least in part, we're able to segment the Russian society based on the salience of identity, and to demonstrate the correlation between support of the war and the salience of our collective self-esteem. And unfortunately, it also suggests that support for the Russian militaristic action has micro foundations in the composites of the Russian collective self, which goes, unfortunately, beyond just Putin alone, and actually says that there's something about how Russians see themselves that they make them more militaristic, more responsive to militaristic messaging. In this context, focusing on generic counter disinformation is not likely to do anything, because these groups are just not going to be seeing those messages as credible unless those messages belong to certain credible sources. Accordingly, we need to structure our counter disinformation effort with those findings in mind. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, the third speaker in our program is Natalia Savalyova from the University of Wisconsin, who will be talking on the Russian exodus to Dubai following the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, hello everybody. So yeah, I go first today. I will talk about rich Russians in Dubai. So as you know, after the beginning of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, a lot of Russians leave the country, right? So we know a lot about Russians who left and went to Georgia or Armenia. Many went to Europe, of course, right? To Germany, to Finland. Some went to the US, but there was some Russians who went to Dubai, and that's kind of like undiscovered topic, I would say, right? What is interesting about those Russians that, well, pretty obvious. Those people that have a significant amount of health, because Dubai is expensive, it's just impossible. Like you can go to Georgia and then come back, but you cannot really go to Dubai. I mean, that will be really hard for you, right? So yeah, there are some obvious reasons for going to Dubai. you have money, there are direct flights with Russia, and there was more direct flights were open last year. So now you can take the data flight and go there like really cheap. A lot of tourists because of that, since they don't have access to any other countries, they go to Dubai, right? Another very important reason is no taxes, right? If you're an entrepreneur or if you do some kind of blogging or an influencer or you do cryptocurrency, that's very good for you. You don't pay taxes. So all the taxes, they're kind of like hidden and very expensive prices for everything. Language, you don't need to learn local language because that's an expat country, right? A lot of people are foreigners, actually, they speak English. So that also makes people feel pretty comfortable. There was this idea that was also easy to open a bank account, but it's not that easy because actually you need to have a Dubai ID, which means that you have to be employed or you have to have a lot of money and put them in the local bank. So I would say it's kind of like easy compared to Europe when maybe they didn't want to open your bank account because you were Russian, but not that easy, right? And the other reason, which was also very important, no hostility toward Russia. So in many countries, in European countries, in Georgia, there was this idea that Russians are aggressors, right? Obvious. So nobody loves Russians, and people felt that, right? So they felt kind of this collective guilt and also a lot of Ukrainian flags, and also they felt that people don't really like them. So in Dubai, there was nothing like that, and also makes people go there. And as a result of all that, plus sanctions, plus inability of European countries to go there, to just move there easily or to visit them for tourism, what we see is over the last 2 years, there was this huge increase in amount of tourists who went to Dubai. So Dubai actually became one of those major destinations. You go to the most popular Russian districts, like Marina districts, you will feel like you are somewhere in Anapa in summer, right? So Russians are everywhere, everybody speaks Russian, and everybody go to the beach. Right, but also a lot of people from Russia in the last 2 years obtained Dubai ID, United Arab Emirates ID, which means that they have, like, they get jobs there or they have bank account, means they have significant amount of money. So that was kind of move toward this place. And my main question was like, okay, so there was I'm sure you saw those articles in the media which says like, well, look at those horrible rich Russians who moved to Dubai. They actually like Putin, they support the war. And I also like Dubai because you can buy expensive bags there, right? And you can have your expensive bag. So my question was like, okay, why Dubai? Why people move there? Do they have any connections with Russia? Are they going, do they have an impact, right? Are they going to come back? Can they influence somehow what's going on in Russia? So yeah, what I discovered, well, first, like Russians in Dubai, they become fast a part of very like class society, like sort of tribes, right? So there are different groups there, and they're not very much connected. So yes, obviously the first groups, very wealthy Russians, they exist separately. They don't hang out with more like middle-level Russians, right? Don't have a lot of context with them. There are info-gypsy, those people who kind of like followed this flow of rich Russians in order to create content. They also create a sort of like separate groups, right? Sometimes they just come there, then they leave. There are cryptocurrency people, crypto anarchists, again, just separate groups, very often very leftist anarchists, right? They love Dubai because no taxes. The fourth group is actually the group which I studied. Those people are entrepreneurs and professionals who in Russia, I mean, either they have pretty successful businesses, right? Or they were on the top level of Russian or international corporations. And when the war started, they decided to leave the country and they just either became employed in international corporations again in Dubai, or they were able to open their own business, or they actually just stayed in United Arab Emirates and continue spending their money, right? There is also this group of people. So the last two groups of people, they basically kind of like the part of this service environment, right? So professionals in fashion, entertainment, food industry. So those people, they basically follow those rich Russians and almost rich Russians, right, to serve their needs, right, to open some cool new restaurants for them, to develop beauty industry there, so just to support their needs, whatever they want. And we're service workers, and they represent a completely like separated group of people. They live they live with another immigrants, right, in other parts of the city, and they don't really interact a lot on everyday. I mean, they do interact with rich Russians and almost rich Russians, but they serve them. So, where is it? Okay, so well, first thing which surprised me, which is probably the part of how I assembled people, is that pretty much all with whom I talked, they had either a positionist view, so they were against the war, right? Or they were very reluctant about talking about like anyhow discussing the question of war, and I will say why. So, and the motivation they have to leave Russia to move to Dubai had two just big parts. Economic reasoning was the first. I mean, those two parts, they kind of like, they just coexisted, right? None of them were more important. Economic reasoning and political reasoning. So for economic reasoning, well, first, professionals, people who work in like top management positions in Russian corporations, the idea was like, okay, so yeah, we don't like the war, we hate Putin, but also now because of sanctions, Russia becomes a pariah, right? So that means that in the long term, there won't be enough space here for professional development, right? The market will shrink. So if you think about your career, you just have to move forward. Right, and sometimes they choose to buy not because they actually chose it, but because they applied and some corporations got there. Entrepreneurs, they have slightly different reason, which I find really interesting because it kind of we see how entrepreneurial ethic, like about leaving the zone of comfort and the importance of crisis in your work, how it really influenced the way they think, or at least they present the decision to leave Russia. What they say, like, well, okay, we kind of like was thinking about leaving Russia for a long time, but nothing actually pushed us. But recently, in the last 2 years, because of Facebook, because of Instagram was banned, there was just too many obstacles to stay here. We do something, we could be pursuing entirely different outcomes more actively by employing the same efforts as here. So it's kind of like made sense. And also the war. So the war just pushed us. We're like, okay, this is our chance. This is a crisis. Now we have to move. If not war, maybe we'll never change another country for our business. And I have a nice quote where the guy who was a head of pretty successful, also supported by government tech enterprise in Russia. So that's how he described the decision which he and his team made. They're like, okay, so there was problem, and then like, yeah, the crisis hit, and we thought, okay, if this doesn't push us, so nothing else would, and we just started more actively discovering our opportunity. And another interesting thing about the impact of this entrepreneurial ethic is that very often those referenced over not just the crisis, but stay positive, be constructive. It helped people who didn't want to talk about the war. It helped them to avoid this topic completely, right? When I just tried to very carefully ask them, so what exactly, when the war started, how did you feel? And we're like, okay, I don't want to talk about it. Just let's not talk about bad things. I focus on staying positive. We should be constructive. So that kind of this entrepreneurial ethic also help them, again, maybe for themselves, maybe forever, others probably for both, just to stay away from this topic of the war and make this transition easy for them. Political reasoning. So what we see here, especially for those people who were openly against the war, is very similar reactions to what we've seen in like ordinary oppositionist Russians, right? So shock when they learned about the beginning of the war. And this shock was then another shock probably when they saw that there is no mass anti-war demonstrations in Russia, right? So like, okay, if people don't want to protest, I leave this country. Yeah, and basically very often they saw their choice as like, my options are pretty limited here, right? So it's impossible to stay in this country and to not be a collaborator. And if you are not a collaborator, you like either drink yourself till death. And that's what many people who left Russia within first months from my sample, that's what they were doing. So they were drinking for several months and then they left, right? So, or you just start doing some crazy things, you protest, you go to prison. So that's how they frame their choice. Like, okay, I cannot be a collaborator, right? So I just leave and I don't want to go to prison and I don't want to die because of alcohol. So that's why I leave. Also fear, especially when the partial mobilization started. So for men, there was a important reason, right? So, or even before that, they kind of like, okay, so that will happen. They will start drafting people. I'm a man. I was in Russian army. I should leave probably. But another thing which I also noticed, which was kind of surprising for me, is that many people with whom I have like a lot of people with whom I talk, they kind of like have some sort of fear about like talking about Russia, talking about war. I mean, in literature, we have this explanation, transnational repressions, right? You can be afraid if you're an activist that the dictator will come, will send somebody and they will kill you, right? But in this case, people also were scared because they preserved some connections, families in Russia. They traveled to Russia, of course, because of their families mostly, right? So they were afraid that there will be some consequences. So there was very often, there was very, very careful when, like in private conversation, they were talking about anything related to Putin and to the war. What is interesting about this group, as I said, they kind of like not not just average Russians because they have much more money, right? So and in Russia, those people earned starting from 500,000 rubles, which is not that much for the US, but in Russia they will be somewhere 10 times more than like average salary, right? And more, like several millions per month. So of course they had resources to move to Dubai, right? And for them, Dubai, because of those resources, but also because of the specificity of their previous social trajectory, what they did, there was not an escape, there was not a flee, right? So like, okay, why not? Yes, why not just fleeing here? Actually, this is our choice. We decide that we don't want to like stay. We don't want to just be the part of this regime. And many of them, they were like, okay, and this is, I feel that this is how I do my choice. It's impossible to do anything in this particular situation, but at least where I preserve like my ability to act is to leave this country. And that was pretty different from ordinary what ordinary Russians felt. Also, the second interesting thing was this feeling of powerlessness and loss of agency, right? So as well as ordinary Russians, they didn't feel that they can influence the situation anyhow. But they used very different arguments. So what they said, they never said like, oh, you know, maybe this war has a reason and Putin knows better and we just don't know what Putin thinks. So they never used arguments like that. The arguments were more like, okay, we just don't have access to those people. But yeah, in general, they were like, okay, what can I do? The only choice, only real choice I have is a choice to leave. And the last thing which really intrigued me was that so one of my questions was like, okay, so you left Russia, authoritarian country, to move to Dubai, which is also an authoritarian country. That's kind of like a little bit confusing, right? So please tell me why. And many of them said, of course, this is like this idea was affected by the experience of being in Dubai, right? And for them, it was also very important that nobody just tried to shame them for the war, for being Russian. And they said like, well, actually, there are some bad authoritarian countries like Russia, and there are some good authoritarian countries like Dubai. So here, yeah, you cannot protest, that's fine. But the state actually provide you with a lot of resources and a lot of opportunities, and stay away from your private life. If you're gay, that's fine. You just live your private life, that's okay. While in Russia, we have a lot of resources, and yeah, where those resources go. The last thing I say, so there was an interesting paradox. So many of those rationalists, were very ambiguous, right? So like, okay, we go to Dubai because it's kind of like nobody tries to remind us here that we should be ashamed of our country, because and the argument was like, okay, one guy said like, okay, I'm scrolling through the news every day anyway. I'm like already left everything in Russia. I left my business and all my money, and I'm like read those news every day, and it just makes me super depressed. I'm suffering already, so I don't want other people to remind me about all that, right? And that's why they perceive Dubai in a sort of like this double way. So they complain like, okay, that's like toxic positivity.
We need to wrap up.
Yes, that's a toxic positivity. People don't talk about the war here. It's like Rublevka. Just moved to Palm, but at the same time, that's kind of nice too, right? Because you can forget a little bit. That's like a sort of a safe haven where you can really forget about the war. And I stop here. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry for being.
No worries. Thank you very much. Thanks. All right, and our final speaker on the panel is Margarita Zawadzkaya from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and she'll be talking on supporting the war versus supporting Putin.
Hello, everyone. It's always a bit hard to be the last speaker on the panel, so I'll try to be as entertaining as possible, although the topic is probably the least entertaining since we're kind of trying to, I'm going back from wonderful Dubai and people having fun back to Russia when actually there are 50 shades of conformity and probably not really conformity. So here I'm trying to kind of, all my previous presentations were about good Russians, right? Like those who escaped after the February 24th today. So I'm not gonna say bad Russians, okay? So I will not, I'm not gonna do that. So let me explain why. This is the first results from our online panel survey. So we just conducted on the eve of the Russian presidential campaign, the first wave of this study, and we found some interesting findings I really wanted to share. And I also kind of, as a spoiler, I'm happy to kind of to tell you that these findings also were in concurrence with other projects. So I think Henry is a part of the big Russia election study, also online, although face-to-face survey that also kind of takes place in Russia on a regular basis. And our findings are strikingly similar. So which means that actually probably what we found is not a fluke, it's something real, hopefully. And we try to kind of stick to the best principles and practices outlined by Greg Yudin that I shared Greg's sentiment in the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that I was shocked how Russian surveys were used by analysts and professionals and journalists. And my first reaction was purely emotional, like, okay, it's only for professional use. So please don't touch this data and the survey data. So because you don't know how to interpret that. That was my first emotional reaction. Then I pulled myself together and realized, okay, we really need to kind of live in this new world. Okay, these people will like kind of bring this Nevada data, will show this crazy 80%. Okay, this is the word. This is what it is. What it is. The same Levada, actually, if you commission a survey to them, and if you kind of provide a slightly different questionnaire, so the numbers will be slightly different. So what I'm trying to say is not like Levada data are rubbish. It's not the case. No, they're doing very good and decent job. So they are honest and professional people. So I deeply respect what they're doing. But what I'm trying to say is that we really need, before I move on with my analysis of survey data, exactly the way as Greg Givian did in his presentation. So I really want to warn you that public opinion polls are often used as a weapon or weaponization. So this is a term actually that was eloquently used by Max Olikov, my colleague from the University of Manchester. So that's kind of a tool to essentialize and kind of tarnish the whole population of very different groups of people with very different views and very different strategies. So I think it's really important for us as political analysts to understand, disentangle these kind of ebbs and flows, how political support is being built. So I'm not doing policy advocacy here. So just to be clear on this side, But I really wanted to kind of, remind you about, being very cautious using, working with this data. Before I show you some numbers, I really wanted to kind of tell you a very quick story. Before 4 months before the presidential elections in March, together with a brave group of Helsinki students, we started working together with Russian Domestic Monitor, Golos. It's a very known, reputable organization here. I think I don't need to explain who they are. We help them to kind of conduct monitoring of Russian television. So like a group of 15 scholars were watching Russian news for students, right? So I hope Golos would pay for their therapy afterwards. They did not, unfortunately, but for very good reasons. They're also in big trouble, as we know. What we found out in doing this monitoring and publish reports on a weekly basis is that there was not a single case when Putin appeared as news story would overlap with the military news story. There wasn't a single case like that. So this suggests that probably, and not even probably, I think it's very likely that Putin campaigners or spin doctors were trying to distance Putin, his image from the war, what was going on in the battlefields. That was a kind of a conscious strategy. So, well, given the fact that we kind of meticulously watched all these news manually, semi-manually, or semi-automatically for more than 4 months, so I think these findings are quite robust. So which means that probably manifestations of political support, like this kind of sacrosanct triad, supporting Putin, being willing to vote for Putin, and approving the special military operation, meaning the war, so is not necessarily the same thing. They don't usually come as a single package. So I think what is really important for us is to look at the inconsistency within this triad. It's not only me and our team at the University of Helsinki who is working on that, but also there was a brilliant opinion piece published by Tim Fry and his colleagues in Foreign Affairs, also emphasizing pretty much the same phenomena, that doesn't necessarily mean if someone supports Putin, he or she will support the special military operation of the war, and vice versa. And the same holds true. If someone is willing to vote for Putin, doesn't mean that actually that person supports the war. Or if someone supports Putin, doesn't mean he or she would vote for Putin. So, and this is exactly what we're doing, looking at this inconsistency. So like kind of the Russian political ideology is pretty patchwork, as we know. What is the most interesting things are happening, at the strange connections between these inconsistencies. So without any further ado, let me show you some very basic distributions from the first wave of our survey. This is online survey, 5,000 respondents. It's online, but it's very close to the census data. We weighted this data, so they look quite comparable with regular telephone surveys or face-to-face surveys. So if you're interested, I would be happy to share all the metadata if it's of any interest for you. So what I really want to emphasize here, so that the support for Putin is incredibly high, so no surprises here. So like it's 75%. So look at the yellow bar. So as predicted, no surprises. If we look at government and the State Duma, again, as always, State Duma is the least loved federal institution again. So what we see here actually is quite intuitive, and it follows our general and overall understanding of Russian political support. If we move a little bit to the next plot, so this is the voting intention. So we ask people, so for whom you would like to vote, or whether you already voted for someone, because our survey overlapped with this is a multiple day, 3 days vote. So some respondents had already voted at the time when we surveyed them. So it's 55%. So 55% of our respondents said that they voted or they're going to vote for Putin. So it's still less than 87% of the official electoral outcome, but still 55. It's quite a lot, right? So it's a bit less than the official results, but this is quite interesting. So look at the don't knows. It's almost 20%. Do not plan to vote, 10%. Spoil the ballot, 3%. And those people like Devenkov, who voted for probably the focal point for the Russian opposition, who kind of followed the Navalny political testimony. So it's 5%. So these people we ran some regression. So these people are very likely to be voters, or critiques of how many vote them in her analysis. So altogether, this is not 13% as in Maria's survey, but it's slightly more. It's about like 30% or 25%, right? So if we if we sum up these numbers together. And finally, so we decide, okay, what about the support for the war? Going back to our experience with election monitoring. So what's going on with support of the war? Probably you're familiar with some previous attempts to measure support for the war by, for instance, Philipp Chepkovsky, Max Schaub. They found out that people actually were lying, especially women, especially older than 40 years old, 40 years for some reasons. We decided to kind of repeat pretty much the same design, but we did some tweaks. So this is just basic description of the sample. So we randomly assign different lists with a sensitive item. So here is the example of our questionnaire with and without sensitive item plus placebo tests. We also run like a number of placebo tests, so I'm not going to bombard you with all these technicalities, but this is a general kind of overall layout. So our respondents were supposed to choose how many policies they would agree or disagree with. Introduction to the school syllabus, conversation about important matters, разговоры о важном in Russian, increasing the military budget by reducing social spending, the beginning of Russia's military operation on Ukrainian territory, Russia's rapprochement with European countries, and raising the minimum wage. We try to be very careful with ceiling, potential ceiling effects, and so on and so forth. So we hopefully, the findings, final results, they pass all the necessary statistical tests, so I'm not going to bother you with them. So without any further ado, these are the results. So this is the support for the war, 50%, almost 50%. This is experimental result. So then it comes to direct questions. So it's 47%. And if we also decided to play a little bit with the wording, so we added the option refuse to answer, like explicit way for our respondents to kind of, refrain, abstain from reacting to this question. So these are the numbers. So in the last column, so it's just 43%. What is really striking here, I think you already noticed, it's not 80%, it's 50. It's still a lot. Like 50% once the war, believe that the war was launched was justifiable. It's quite scary, but compared to other results and previous findings, so it's significantly lower. It's like at least 30% percentage points lower than the other results, and I think it's also overlaps with Henry, probably what you found in your last survey. What is really no preference falsification whatsoever, by the way. If you look at the EVA bar, so we don't really see that our respondents lie about their support of the war, which is also quite interesting and intriguing. So people are generally not very scared of that question. So probably it's a little bit cognitively difficult because we were asking about the beginning of the war. So it's a little bit more cognitive burden on the respondents. But this is something we can discuss together if you want to. What is really striking, if we break down this experiment by gender, this is what we see. And these findings are statistically significant. Again, no clear, no obvious preference falsification, but women, they are way less likely to support the war compared vis-a-vis men. And if we look at the green bars, we see that men actually are way more belligerent compared to women. They even slightly tend to lie and kind of don't play their belligerent moods against women. Women sort of mirror male respondents here. So this is quite exciting. I think quite intuitive as well, but I think we kind of found a pretty robust confirmation that there is a significant gender gap in support of the war in Ukraine. Who are these people? So we were in the beginning of my talk, I mentioned these inconsistencies. Who are these strange anti-war loyalists? People who kind of this slide shows us these are very likely to be women, and this is really true. So we decided to run some models and regression models in just one of them. So who are those Russian respondents who clearly, unequivocally do not support the war, but they still are willing to support Putin? So you see what I mean. So, and these are the results. Sorry, it's not very nicely ordered, but what you can see here, so they're more likely to be women. These respondents are less likely to be very well versed in politics.
But just to clarify, what's the baseline? Is relative to all other people or just Putin supporters?
Putin supporters.
Okay.
We have both, but these are
Mm-hmm.
pretty similar. Yeah. So Putin supporters is the baseline here. So those who are slightly younger, right? So if we run the same model for those who kind of who are pro-war but against Putin, so we will get this very predictable super patriotic pattern. So this is why I'm not showing this because it's quite clear. So what is really interesting, I think, this group of people. And finally, so they are more likely to be women and people around them, so are more likely to support Putin. So it's a kind of a peer pressure support or endogenous support theory. So it's a theory developed by my colleagues, which we also kind of found some confirmation for that mechanisms of political support. So which means that these are pretty much overlap with the profile of those young women who were protesting like a few months ago in Russia, right? I think it rings a bell. So that's the very early findings. So I was given 10 minutes, so I really want to stick to my time boundary. So let me just summarize this very early findings. So sorry, I think I barely mentioned any academic references in my presentation because I really wanted to share kind of bombard you with the findings. I'm very curious what you think about it. We are about to publish a more detailed report on that based on that survey literally in 1 week period on our project's website. So I will do some, probably through Ivan Greg, some advertisement of this report. So feel free to familiarize. It's 85 pages with plenty of graphs. So, but these are probably the most interesting. So the first takeaway message is support for the war is lower than support for Putin. So this is quite clear. The question is to what extent, right? We don't really find any preference falsification vis-a-vis the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, right? I'm not saying that the previous findings by Max Schaub and Philip Tchaikovsky were wrong. It means that probably something changed over time. It's been more than 2 years, right? Something had to change. Well, we also found out significant gender differences. Women are less likely to support the war. So there are probably very good reasons for that. And finally, we're very curious about this special group of anti-war loyalists. Who are these people? Because this is potentially kind of a swing constituency actually who could have attributed blame a bit differently, right? So there was if you were following the women's protests in the end of the last year, so you're probably also aware that there was a kind of a split within those protests. Some women, they got more radical and more open. One of them even gave an interview to Ekaterina Gordeeva, a foreign agent. The rest actually are still somewhere hiding in the shadow. So I think it's kind of also reflects those interesting processes within this kind of 50 shades of being loyal and in conformity with the Russian political regime. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, I think we can now go ahead and start the discussion phase. I'll maybe take the prerogative of the chair and just ask maybe a quick question or make a comment to each of the speakers. And then what we'll do is we'll collect several questions, then direct them back to the panel for discussion. And then we'll have another wave and as many as we have time for. So again, all the presentations really interesting, and I find the research on which they're based fascinating and important. So just, I guess my question for Greg is, what do you think supporting peace or beginning peace negotiations means? Because this could mean just that while people support the war, they're happy with the territorial gains that Russia got and they want to internationally recognize. So it might not necessarily be kind of anti-war. So for Maria, I think, I guess my main question would just be, it's like fascinating research, and I think also very important. And I think, in general, you're onto something really important. But a lot of the research on identity shows, right, identity itself isn't a constant, right? It's a construct, so I think Greg mentioned, and it's also something that can change over time and change pretty dramatically at different points in time. So I guess my question is, is there a possibility that the initiation of the war altered the levels of identification with Russia of people who might have been open to